FAO is proud to present Paulo Canaveira.
Good morning, everyone. I will be talking about the substitution effects in cork products. This is actually part of a larger study that was commissioned by FAO on the impacts of cork oaks landscapes in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation, which contained a section about the substitution effect. Just a little introduction. Cork is the iconic product of the cork oak forests, which grow in a relatively limited part of the world. They exist mostly in Portugal, Spain, and Morocco, but also in Algeria, France, and Italy, and a little bit in Tunisia. As I said, the main product from this forest is not actually wood, is cork, and cork is the bark of this tree. And unlike what happens in other trees, when you remove the bark, the tree doesn't die, and so it sustains successive productions of cork over its lifetime. The picture you see there is actually a forest which has been harvested, and you see that there are two shades in the bark of the tree. There are two shades. The darker one shows the area where the bark was extracted, and as you can see, the forest is still there and green. The study asked us to look at how climate change policies and how cork oak forests contribute to these policies. There are basically two families of climate change policies. The ones that are most commonly talked about is mitigation, which is about addressing the emissions or the causes of climate change itself. But there's also an important family of policies looking at adaptation, which is to see how we can actually live with a different climate than the one we have today. As I said, the study looks at all these different aspects of climate policy in relation to cork oak forests, but I'll be looking at the impacts of the forest products in relation to this. So the substitution effect is really looking at different what-if scenarios. There's usually talking about energy substitution, which is looking at different ways of producing the energy we need. This could be electricity, but it can also be heat. And the usual way we've been doing this in our societies is we've been using fossil fuels. The picture illustrates the use of oil, but it could also be coal or other fossil fuels, like natural gas. And basically what we're doing there, we're taking carbon which is buried deep underground, and we're transforming that into an open flow where that carbon eventually accumulates in the atmosphere as CO2 as we use it to produce energy. On the other hand, when we use carbon from forests, there's actually a closer cycle of carbon where the carbon from trees is transformed into energy, but then the CO2 that is released is recaptured by trees that are growing again on the same plot after that energy production has taken place. And so, even though it's not a completely closed cycle, it's a much more closed cycle than with the fossil fuels case. The case of material substitution is slightly different. In that area, what we're trying to do is we're trying to analyze, for the same function, we're trying to analyze what is the different impacts of using one material or another material. And therefore, it's really much to see if we have a need from society, what is the alternative to meet that need that requires less emissions in its production. And so the most iconic product of cork is, of course, the cork stoppers that we see in many bottles of wine across the globe. But there are alternatives in plastic and aluminium. This study by PricewaterhouseCoopers and other studies have been comparing the impact of producing these wine stoppers from different materials. The most common ones are, as I said, aluminium and plastic. And in particular, aluminium has very high emissions in its production. And so for the same amount of stoppers, we can see that the natural cork is actually the one delivering the lower emissions. Comparing the alternatives, we can see that the savings for 1,000 stoppers are about 24 kilograms comparing to aluminium, and about 1.2 kilograms compared to plastic. If we then see the impact of all the bottle stoppers that are produced in cork, if they had been produced by aluminium or plastic, we see that over the last 10 years, the impact would have been in the order of magnitude of 0.8 million tons of emissions that would have taken place if instead of cork, aluminium stoppers would have been produced. And about much less, of course, with plastic, but it would still be 250,000 tons of CO2 that would have been emitted if instead of cork, plastic stoppers would have been used. And so this shows the importance of a totally different industry, in this case the wine industry, the choices they make on how they do something as simple as putting a top on top of their bottle, the impact that has on emissions. And this can be expanded to other products. And although initially cork was basically used for cork stoppers, there has been a lot of innovation and a lot of research being put into other uses of cork. And cork is now a very common product in other uses as insulation material. The fact that cork is a natural bark that was, if you like, designed by nature to protect the tree against forest fires. It becomes it is by its evolution a very insulative alternative insulation material. And what you see here is that the most common insulation materials that are in use between the EPS foam slab and the polyurethane compared with cork-based cellulose or wood products in the last years is as an alternative for flooring and so basically as a construction material. Which is a very common material used in floorings, is also performing much better in terms of emissions. In these cases, the production statistics are less available, and so it's more difficult to evaluate the total impact of the use of these materials so far. But it's also likely we can also foresee that more and more alternatives of cork will be coming into the market. There's now textiles made with cork. There's a number of different products being produced. There's also uses of cork in energy, and so the impact of cork in terms of mitigation of climate change may actually be increasing in the near future. Just to finalize. What we see from the literature is that cork products can contribute to mitigation of climate change by providing alternatives which are better than their competitors in terms of emission performance. But the assessment of this contribution difficult to quantify, except for the case of cork stoppers, which I made before, and also that the diversity of cork applications is of course growing over to other products that are coming into the market. Thank you very much for your attention.